these links up while you're going online. Maybe I
think we're online now.
Okay.
Right. So hello, I'm Ali Malik, and welcome to another CMB's monthly events. We do this. We used to do this in London regularly, but because of COVID, we can't have many people in one space. So we decided to switch to online since then. And we are trying to continue online and do one in London as well at the same time. So today we are joined by Gita Sahgal. She's a writer, a journalist, a filmmaker, a co-founder of Southall Black Sisters, done human rights work for ethnic minority women and for everybody essentially. She's got a big portfolio, and we'll be talking about racism, identity politics, and liberation today. Mariam Namazi was supposed to be with us today, but she's not feeling well. She sends her regards and her apologies for not being able to join us. Before, without wasting any time, I think I'll just throw it over to you, Gita. And if you can take us through the topics of the day, and then after that, we can take questions and answers.
Yeah. Hello, everybody. And hello, Ali. I've been in some of your chats and I've really enjoyed them before as well that you've been doing during lockdown. So I'm sad we're not meeting in person, but I think this is something that was planned a very long time ago by Mariam, long before this latest upsurge in Black Lives Matter and statues coming down or not coming down and all these discussions. So it's something that's been on our minds because, as you know, CMB works, Council for Ex-Muslims works on religion. It works on the issue of Islam specifically and what happens to Muslims under Islam, particularly in countries where there are blasphemy laws and other kinds of persecution. So even in Britain, as we all know, there's family persecution, there's first persecution in the community. People don't feel safe. They don't feel safe to say that they've left Islam. Or that they're gay, or sometimes that they want to marry whom they choose. You know, all these things are happening. And sometimes those things seem to be unrelated to the agenda of talking about racism. You know, that, you know, why is everybody insisting that racism is the only issue? You know, we have all these other issues which are to do with internal matters, to do with the community. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the ways that I've tried to deal with these things, because all my life I've dealt with both racism and with religion and issues of promoting secularism and religious fundamentalism in all religions. And Britain is a confusing country that way, because it's on the one hand a very liberal country. You know, it doesn't have as much segregation as other countries have, including the countries that we came from, India, Pakistan, you know, the kind of caste hierarchies, the kind of intense, entrenched class, caste, and religious divisions that people have, and the risks that people take if they step outside those divisions. So Britain, in that sense, is a much more liberal country. And so some people, I know there's been a discussion saying, you know, what's with this? Why is these American issues being imported to Britain? They're nothing to do with us, and so on. But I think they are relevant, and they're relevant here in the British context. And indeed, I feel we cannot understand the religious issues unless we understand the background of racism. And we can't understand the way in which the British government looks at issues of minorities, and I mean successive British governments. I think it's particularly acute now under the Tories in ways that, if I don't get to explaining, please ask me about. But I think the issue of identity politics has been played in various ways by all governments in this country. And so it's a major issue. And that's really what I want to talk to you about, as well as my own battles with both on challenging racism and the anti-racism establishment, and how that also relates to challenging religion as well. So those are the things that some of the sorts of things that I could cover. And I've sent you some links that perhaps you can share, because they're about relevant articles and videos and stuff like that.
Yeah, I'm posting them in the chats now. So if anybody wants to have a look at them, click on that and right, that's posted.
Okay, so
Okay.
we both live in times of huge change and in a time of amnesia. And
Yeah.
it's a kind of willed amnesia that we have. And to start off, I really want to quote from this Kipling poem. It's quite a famous poem, and it's called The English Flag. And he says, "Winds of the world give answer. They are whimpering to and fro. And what should they know of England, who only England know? The poor little street-bred people that vapor and fume and brag, they are lifting their heads in the stillness to yelp at the English flag." And Kipling here is deriding the little people, the little street-bred people who do not understand the greatness of England if they only understand England. They do not understand England's greatness because it lies elsewhere in its remarkable reach across the empire. And to me, we cannot discuss identity politics without looking at the convulsions of British identity politics. And by that, I don't mean the politics of anti-racism, or rather, not only the politics of anti-racism, but the utterly childish scream of rage that is encompassed in one word, and that's Brexit.
Brilliant. Thank you for starting at a point where I wanted to start as well, historically. So if we look at the term identity politics, started in the 70s. So I guess if we start by the usefulness we had of this term back in the day, in the 70s and 80s, and I know you were quite active in those days. In the 80s, I presume you established Southall Black Sisters. How useful was this term for you and in your struggle back in those days? And then we'll come back to the current position and the current identity politics we have now.
See, Ali, well, if Pragna is probably far too busy to be watching this, my very old friend Pragna Patel, who goes right back to that time, and she'll remember, because she never lets me forget, that I've always been very cynical about the idea of identity politics and the term identity politics. I always used to laugh like anything about the various autonomous groups and the arguments that people had about, who is a Black person. I mean, I come from an era where we called ourselves Black. Southall Black Sisters is still called Black. It gets attacked both from the right because it's a Black group. It gets attacked by some other Black groups because why are you a largely Asian women's group calling yourself Black, and so on. So all these arguments go on. Nevertheless, in spite of recognizing the absurdity of many of these categories, they are essentially political categories. So it was embraced at that time because there was extreme racism that was being experienced on the streets. The National Front were marching in the streets. The police were protecting the National Front marches and arresting in huge numbers the people protesting against the National Front. And in fact, for years and years, one of the key issues that Southall mobilized about was to get justice for the killing of a man by the police and to find out exactly who it was that had killed him, among the police, and to hold them accountable. And the man was a white man called Blair Peach. But he had been an anti-racist campaigner, and he'd been on the streets supporting the anti-racist demonstrations, and he'd been murdered by being hit with a baton. And so for 10 years after that, we were marching every year to remember Blair Peach. And, there were the movements. His partner, fought to, get the police to disclose their records and find out who, in these sort of helmeted police officers. There's a group called the Special Patrol Group that was particularly violent and so on. So even at that moment of what's a Black uprising, there were always white allies. So, this was not about a separatist movement. This was about movements saying that we are racist. We face a racist society, but we also face, when we set up the women's group, we were saying we're also facing a sexist society. And the sexism of that society comes both from the state and from the community. So for some of the earliest campaigns that the Black women's groups fought were, for instance, against virginity testing, which is basically a form of sexual assault by the state on women coming into the country to test they were virgins so that they could be, they really were brides, that they weren't married women.
It was happening here in Britain.
It was happening here in Britain.
Wow.
And for all I know, still happens in some places. But, there was a major campaign against it. And there were also campaigns about people being separated from their families. So we also had a very different relationship to the demands we made on the state. It's not that we didn't demand protection from the police and so on, but we were always much more aware that this has a dual edge, that if you call the police in some homes, it may lead to the husband being arrested and deported, rather than simply being arrested for the particular crime. So it's a sort of double punishment. And we didn't want to cooperate with the government on implementing racist immigration laws. That was very different from like the mainstream other feminist groups who were much more keen to use those kinds of immigration laws and so on. So we had differences in politics, but we allied with those groups. For instance, I made a film on a woman called Kiranjit Ahluwalia who had killed her husband. And she killed her husband after 10 years of facing domestic violence. And in fact, her husband's uncle wrote to the Home Secretary, filled with guilt after she went to jail, because he said quite openly that we thought she'd be the one who'd die. I mean, they knew she was facing violence. They thought she would die, but she ended up killing him.
Right.
So we said that, look, we didn't justify killing, but we said this has happened for a reason. She's had a very harsh sentence, and we fought a long campaign, and that changed the law on provocation, and eventually many other women who'd been jailed because they retaliated against domestic violence. So in that campaign, we were among the leaders of it, but there were also other women's groups, largely white, who were dealing with other cases, Justice for Women, and we worked together. And they still exist. They've now started a legal group called the Center for Women's Justice. So there was both organizing on our own, but organizing alongside other groups when we had the common platform. So it was taking up specific issues that affected us, but that looked outwards into making those alliances as well. But keeping our own views and critiques of the state, not having to go through an enormously bureaucratic procedure to, convince a whole lot of other people who didn't agree with us. So we had that autonomy to make the decisions, as the ex-Muslims have, for instance, because a wider atheist movement does not necessarily recognize the specific issues that ex-Muslims are fighting, and although there's a lot of support from the wider atheist movement, but they don't necessarily understand, those things in their full dimension. So that those were some of the things that we fought. And then, of course, Rushdie. I mean, when we took up the issue of religious fundamentalism, right, this is not a women's movement issue. The first time we raised it was actually at a March 8th meeting, so International Women's Day meeting in 1989, just after the fatwa. And we said we were organizing in Southall Black Sisters with the local Labour Party, women's section of the Labour Party. And they said, they said, we can't, they said, what should we organize about? And we said, we want to organize about religious fundamentalism and how it affects women's lives. And they were like, really? Why not South Africa? Why not Palestine? Some international solidarity. We were like, no, we want to do this. And because, again, we had good relationships with them, and, we worked in the local area together and so on. Some people in Southall Black Sisters were Labour Party members, others weren't. But, it was a good relationship. That was when we had our first meeting and read out a statement about Rushdie at that meeting. So for me, that identity politics was precisely what led me, that form of identity politics, that what I would call the politics of autonomy, which was also a politics of universalism. It was that these issues are not being recognized in the wider movement. Right. We can't wait till the penny drops in, some other leader's mind, including the older anti-racist women, who of course accused us of racism. Because we marched in the streets against women, not against women, but for women where they had been killed in houses or committed suicide, just after calling the police, and they're found dead the next day. And so we organized demonstrations as we'd done in India before. I'd come from India just very shortly, a few years before. And so some of the older Asian feminists were like, we're going to do this. Just like Muslims have done various things that are considered provocative and outrageous, we're going to do it. So we did it. And a lot of the residents in the area supported us. There were some people were disapproving, some were not, but we were making a stand in the local area where these things were happening, not in central London, not in Hyde Park, but on the streets of Southall. So and we actually went to a women's conference and asked the other women there, other white women, black women, and so on. It was a socialist feminist conference, and we said, please come to Southall and support us. And then they were quite alarmed, because at that stage, the kind of identity politics there was, it was basically white women, fuck off, you're oppressing us and so on. So we said, come and support us. They were like, what? Maybe we shouldn't be there. It's a nation. No, we want you there with us.
The film you mentioned, I've seen that film. It's there is this big Muslim protest going on, anti-Rushdie protest going on, and there are these Southall Black Sister women on one side who are trying to counter-protest this massive protest. If you can remind us the name of that film.
I'll look for it, otherwise I'll waste time now. But it's called Struggle or Submission. And if you Google my name, Gita Sahgal, we can put up links to it. It's because it's on YouTube. I made 2 films about Rushdie. So one was on before the fatwa. So if you can imagine a time before the fatwa, it was like, okay, there's an international campaign building, and it's significant that I worked at that time for a black television company. It was both Asian and Afro-Caribbean. So Tariq Ali, the famous Pakistani left activist, he was the producer, the head honcho on one side, and then there was Darcus Howe, who was a famous anti-racist activist. And this company, we challenged racism all the time. I mean, I made films about racism in employment, a wonderful midwife who'd never got a promotion, so racism in the NHS. We made films about police racism. I made a film about a man called Trevor Monaville, people being beaten. He was beaten, and he didn't remember who'd beaten him up because he was in such a bad state. He survived. And the police and the prison authorities, because he ended up in prison, but the prison authorities said the police did this to him, or the police said the prison did this to him. Right. So it was a mystery how he'd ended up. But in the hands of the state, he'd ended up with extremely bad injuries. And there were years and years of campaigning after that on that. So we were making films about racism all the time. But we also made one of the first films made about Hindutva and the Hindutva movement before the Babri Masjid, the mosque in India, was broken down. We said this movement building of people who, the descendants of people who killed Gandhi are now mobilizing to destroy this mosque and creating mayhem all over India. And in Britain, they're being treated as a cultural group, and they're being funded by the local councils. Now, we know this happened loads of times after that to various Muslim groups, the Jamaat Islami, Muslim Brotherhood groups, but it was also happening then and still is now to Hindutva groups. And so we made this film back in like 86 about that.
Wow.
And so by 89, when we made the Rushdie stuff, it was in the context of a radical Black critique, both of racism, but also what was happening within the community.
Brilliant.
So we the first one, as I said, was before the fatwa, when I interviewed Salman, and he read parts of his book, and we interviewed people who supported him and people who were against him. So the Black MP Bernie Grant was saying, "Oh, it's racist to this book, Satanic Verses. Why is he criticizing Black people? They're oppressed. He should go to Saudi Arabia or Pakistan if he wants to, make a critique of Islam. He shouldn't be saying these things here." And we said, look, this is nonsense. And, we don't agree with extending the blasphemy law. If we want equality, so again, it was an argument about issues of equality, but this time about religion, not race, then let's abolish the blasphemy law that Britain has. Don't extend it to all sorts of other people. But the issue where it also intersects with race, and why we have to go back to the history of empire, is that what is the policy of multiculturalism? When the right talks about it, they say, oh, it's too much tolerance. It's these Labour parties, Labour councils being too over-tolerant to minorities. it's not a tolerant policy. It's a way of letting people rot under systems of indirect rule, which were what were practiced in Africa, the rule of the chiefs, so the indirect rule of the empire, and various systems of, again, of community control that were practiced in Asia as well. So for me, it's that colonial tradition that when we fight religious privilege, we're fighting those remnants of empire. Like, we go, take us to your leader, here are the leaders. And successive British governments, including the Tories, who they criticized Labour for it, that if you examine them in detail, what they did was they told the police, you mustn't talk to the East London Mosque or, some of these other groups. The police went on talking to them or got very angry if they weren't allowed to talk to them. But, the police handed the Finsbury Park Mosque to Muslim Brotherhood groups to run after they got rid of jihadis who were in the mosque. And I don't know if you remember the campaign on the Sharia laws, the One Law for All campaign, which I was involved with, and Southall Black Sisters and ICRO, the Iranian Kurdish women's rights organization. So we were campaigning against the parallel legal systems and the so-called Sharia courts, in this country. And we longed for an inquiry, but when the government set it up, and this is Theresa May's government, they set it up as a theological inquiry with a theologian in charge, with imams as advisors. And we ended up the group that wanted it, the coalition of women's groups that said, we want this inquiry, we want them investigated. And in the end, we had to boycott the inquiry because it was set up on a theological basis. It borrowed the words of a commission called the Wolf Commission, which was about including more faith groups in the public square. And that was an independent commission, but the government took the language and the recommendations from that and didn't even, the inquiry was tasked to find good practice in Sharia, not to see if they're violating human rights.
Just trying to justify somehow.
It was mad. So we actually did much more research than the inquiry did. We had 30 or 40 through the coalition of women's groups. We did all the research into what women faced under these Sharia courts. But one of the things we found was that all the time there's state failure as well. They couldn't exist. They couldn't go on existing. They are charities. They're not secret organizations. Some of them have charitable numbers. Some of them are in mosques, which are charities, so therefore they run under the umbrella of the mosque. Yeah. There may be ones, the ones who are arguing pro-Sharia arguments were saying, these are the good ones, the other ones might be worse, they're in somebody's living room. Maybe they're worse, but the ones we analyzed, we showed that they have links with extreme religious fundamentalists. We showed, how they oppress women. And yet, the message of One Law for All is not, the Tories will use that language and they'll use anti-Muslim bigotry. And so some people will think, they're going to be tough on Sharia. But the evidence that we have is that they're not.
They're not.
They're really not. And for me, this is part of that multicultural politics, that allows them to want to keep this place of religion in public life. Yeah. Now, why do they do that? One of the reasons they do that is because the church and religion has always been used to justify inherent and birth privileges, right? We know that from the stuff we know, the work we do on religion and the way in which people are, invited to join a religion, but then they can't leave. It's a one-way system, or if they're born into it, they may be killed for trying to leave it, and so on. So we know that there are these barriers with religion. In England, in society, there aren't these barriers, but the church still has an established position, right? And the government has been promoting religious schools. So even Michael Gove, who is responsible for some of the worst history education, so he rolled back more progressive history teaching to produce a kind of storybook version of the empire, which has been condemned by teachers unions, by professors at Oxford and Cambridge, saying this is this is like a child's version of history. It's not what modern history teaching is about. It's a lie, basically. So he's doing that on the one hand. He's very anti-jihadi and all the rest of it. He's a neocon. He's sort of supposedly anti-jihadi. But on the other hand, he's giving more space to religious schools because he wants to destroy state education. So he's undermining the universal basis on which we can fight that kind of religious privilege. Meanwhile, nobody's attending church. So the only way that the Church of England keeps its privileges is to hang on to its schooling system, and it stays within the system. And when they had the Sharia inquiry, the judge who was on the inquiry, there was a judge on the inquiry. It wasn't judge-led, but the judge on the inquiry, when I investigated him, I said he's the nearest thing to a Sharia judge because he sits on a Christian ecclesiastical court,
right.
And he belongs to a Christian legal group that is mounting all kinds of challenges on, anti-homophobic laws and so on. In fact, probably promoting homophobia in Africa and other places. So a very right-wing Christian group is what they put as the judge on the Sharia inquiry. And he has no interest in abolishing the Sharia courts. He just wants to make a few little, twiddles here and there. And, make sure they carry on functioning because that's the way they keep justifying their own continued existence.
Completely right. If I there's a couple of things you mentioned, which I completely agree with, that multiculturalism being a colonial era strategy where they'd let people, or the chieftain system, or small dynastical Maharajas or Rajas in India, they kept that. Keeping that in mind, it being a colonial strategy. And the second thing you mentioned, when back in the 80s and 90s, you had a lot of allies from all different backgrounds, racial backgrounds or anything. Identity politics back then meant keeping everything alive, everybody as an ally. When you come to this current climate now, because right now, multiculturalism as a social policy is backed by the anti-imperialists, anti-colonialists. They are backing it completely. It's the leftist agenda now. And identity politics, where not necessarily making allies, but asking them to just listen and just stay behind, not work with us.
Believe me, that was all there before as well.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, you have to battle your way through some of that. All of that, white woman listen, and so for instance, I was in one NGO which had a lot of issues which I don't think were about race actually, but they became about race. And so anyway, so some people in the NGO decided that we must have a racism awareness training. So I attended this racism awareness training, and I mean, I do think white supremacy is an issue. I prefer to call it racism. I do think that, and for this we have to thank what's happened with Brexit, because Brexit is talked about as a form of English liberation against the EU, right? So suddenly the idea of national liberation has become fashionable, right? Now, I think they haven't got their own ideas. They borrowed all these ideas from other movements and incorporated them into talking about England, and something very different is going on. It's in my view, a very far right movement, which is going to leave the mass of people in this country much worse off. And with businesses will have more red tape, and the laws that will be abolished are the laws protecting labor and health and safety laws. So the things that are protective of people will go, and meanwhile there'll be all these other systems set up that are happening now with the mess that we see with COVID and the deaths that are going on. Because they're parallel structures, rather like the Sharia courts, but now being set up by Dominic Cummings. His mates are getting huge contracts in order to do tracing and things like that. And the legal bodies are being left out. So these are long-term strategies that are going to have a bad result and are going to disproportionately affect Black people in this country. That's going on at the same time as the identity-based politics is going on around issues of supremacy, statues, and so on. And I think that we have to very carefully unpick what's happening. So in the middle of a pandemic, when loads of people are dying, I wouldn't have said, I want to concentrate on statues, right? But some people pull down Colston, and I have to say, the Bristol statue, Slaver, I was happy when I saw it pulled down, because there'd been a long movement to try first to take it down, then even to get the language of a plaque, that said this is who he was. And even the language was not agreed. Why? Because the people who put it up, the company that put up the statue called Merchant Ventures, which was in its history a slaving company, is still powerful in Bristol, running, among other things, academy schools. And so part of this agenda of setting up parallel systems that are unaccountable in democratic forums, and they were resisting having the truth told about Colston, right? So I see what's happening there. It's not what I would have chosen, but I see what's happening there as forcing us to confront a history that the British schooling system, progressive teachers had tried to teach some of this. It's not that it was never taught. They tried to put it in here and there in citizenship classes, and a woman called Rosina Visram had she was a teacher, not an academic in university. She'd rehearsed the history of Asians in Britain, and she wrote a book called Ayahs, Lascars and Princes, the history of Asians in Britain. And that's been, updated since then, and PhDs have been written on it. So that history of racism is something that we in this country have not faced. People don't know and don't understand. That's why I've included some stuff about it, George Monbiot talking about it and linking it up to present events. So the name calling, the shouting, the shut up and listen, all that stuff went on then as well. In the racism awareness training course, we were told that, white supremacy was the only kind of supremacy that had existed through time. There was no other. I said, I'm Indian. I kept saying, what about caste?
We have so many issues with
answer about caste, because obviously that is like, one of the worst supremacist systems entrenched in religion that you could ever have. So they didn't, and their theory didn't encompass it. It wasn't that we're not talking about that today. We're talking about modern Britain now, and we need to discuss things. It was very much about inducing guilt in white people. And then they lined us up. They wanted to line everybody up. And this is, I think, a common exercise, like who's the least and who's the most. And then I was saying, well, what about class? Because I don't know how it was supposed to be black women and then black men, white women, white men, something like that. So anyway, then they decided, suddenly they remembered class. They said, oh, you're obviously an uppity woman because you're an elite. So you don't fit in here, or go to the back of the queue or something.
Ranking system, like victimized ranking.
That there is racism in employment. I'm sure you've experienced this in this country. I can't believe you haven't, Ali. Tell me you haven't experienced racism in this country, in looking for employment, in being employed, and so on.
Being completely honest, well, I've been self-employed most of my life, so I haven't had to apply for jobs, but I haven't really experienced any racism in Britain.
You've been lucky, because I have. I mean, not the most acute kind, but I have, and it's not a pleasant thing, where you're not judged.
I can imagine.
On your capabilities, but on your identity, and boxed into that as an identity. But anyway, later in Bandung, in this black program, which had made the Rushdie films, I also made a film about racism awareness training. And I'll try and find a little clip. That film is not up, but there is a clip of Shivanandan, who was a very famous anti-racist or black liberation campaigner, whom I disagreed with on many other issues, because he didn't like it when we raised fundamentalism. He was like, oh, no, this isn't the time. Yes, I agree with you, but this isn't the time to raise it because this is a racist society. He didn't like that. But we agreed with him about the racism awareness training, because his point basically was that, look, I don't want to look into somebody's heart, as what's inside them. I want them to uphold the law. So, if there's a policeman who doesn't like black people, that's not so much my concern, whether he wants to go and have a drink with a black person, whether he's nice to them, whether in his deepest consciousness, what he's feeling. The point is, how does he behave when he's doing his job? So that's looking at institutions and structures and so on. So that's kind of the point that Ken and Malik has been making as well. So these arguments have been around for a long time, and they go round and round, because I think there are issues that people need to address about interpersonal relations, about how you deal with black people, or what are called sometimes people of color, or however you want to, describe that, how you target somebody sitting in the room who is black. And if you listen, I don't know if you've been watching I May Destroy You. There's a BBC series on a really brilliant Black woman called Michaela Cole, who wrote it and was a director on it and a producer. So she had complete artistic control and an actor. I mean, she's really extraordinary. She's very young and she's done extraordinary work. And it's a view of Black London, which has some stuff about racism in it, but it's also about relations among Black people. It's about sexual consent, sexual harassment, issues between people and the police. It's, I think, a brilliant, brilliant piece of drama. But she gave a lecture called the McTaggart Lecture, and she describes how she was treated and other Black actors were treated in the television company that hired her. So, for instance, in the company, when they were doing an earlier film, they had 2 trailers for the actors. So there were 5 Black actors in one trailer, and there was 1 white actor in another trailer. And she, as the writer actor, got a trailer to herself. She was Black, but she was in a special position. But there were 5 actors crammed into one trailer. Then she went and protested to the company, and they changed it. But this is 5 years ago. Yeah. It's unequal treatment that's so blatant. And this is in a liberal sector. We're not talking about people being treated as slaves in undocumented workers and things like that.
Yes.
So
I guess there is one distinction that is to be made as well, that especially in this climate now, first of all, I hate that we have to talk about races. Like I personally think we've got to a time where we should have been able to look beyond race, but unfortunately we haven't. That's the reality of our time. But there is one thing that white people in interpersonal relationships, there is the certain sense of uncomfortability on their part, because they are constantly being told that you don't know how to behave with us. You have to check yourself before you speak to us. And there are so many different denominations now. For example, as you said, when you created Southall Black Sister, it was Black and white. Now there are so many different categories of identity politics. And everybody is telling them that's how you behave with us. And imagine being a young white guy and who's constantly being told that you don't know how to behave with us. There is do you feel the uncomfortability within their behavior? And I think that's to an extent that's a deterrent in harmony that we can have. What do you think about that?
I think it can be awful. I mean, like the examples I've given you, and the film on racism awareness training that we made was very critical of that kind of training, that, it just targets people, telling them to look into themselves. Because the problem that I've seen in the real world is that often that means they don't tackle racism when they find it, or a problem with it, or rather it becomes a racist attitude to tackling problems within other people's communities. So they say, oh, let's leave them alone, so that's, where you get, I mean, I think something else was happening with the grooming gangs. I don't think it was a form of reverse racism against white people. I think it was a form of that racism, which, and class and sex, where young girls were considered to be, by many social workers and others, to be exercising their choices, even though they were being sexually exploited, they were being abused, they were being raped. But they were being seen as girls who were out of control and just doing their thing by social workers and others. But that was within the context of a multiculturalism, where the police will rather say we were being culturally sensitive and use that as an excuse for the fact that they may have been complicit, there may have been corruption. I don't think we've got to the bottom of why the police were not registering these cases, and why. I mean, one case that particularly haunts me from the grooming cases is a young woman who'd reported about a particular man, and he said, "Oh, Mr. So and so, Mr. whoever, Khan, there'll be allegations against him made, and there'll be many more, and you won't be able to do anything about it." And I think, what the hell was going on there? Are these the police informants? Are they using these networks of taxi drivers to get into the community? What is going on there? Because what often happens is that they, and I think that's part of the racism, the state, that's the police or the social workers, things, we would say as the excuse that we were being culturally sensitive. And if you accept that cultural sensitivity was the reason and say, no, we shouldn't be culturally sensitive, you're not looking deeper than that as to why they were either being incompetent or negligent or corrupt or complicit. I mean, those are four big things that we need to be looking at for all these groups. Why there's abuse in children's homes and, all these other things, massive abuse. So yes, there are people who are nervous to act. And I would say, you do need to understand, and we all need to understand how we treat each other in the workplace and so on. And you do need to understand if there are patterns of behavior that there is evidence that people don't get jobs. Sometimes it seems that people have a better chance of getting a job if the CVs are name blind. Because if people see a CV of a name they can't pronounce, they're not likely to shortlist it. This is still happening, so there are measures that you can take to try and counteract that. So there obviously are biases and other issues. But I would say to people, don't get so worried about all those biases that it absolutely stops you giving the solidarity that's necessary in order for people who are challenging their own communities in their own ways. And there, the issue of autonomous politics was important because it was up to the groups who were doing the work who decided how the challenges were going to be made, right? So it may be that there's a campaign where you want to go really loud on some issue and you want to shout from the rooftops about it or do something provocative in order to gain attention. Or there may be another campaign where you say, look, this person's in danger. They're sitting in a refugee camp or something. And if we say anything, it might put them in worse danger. So maybe we need to talk to some local lawyer, try and get them out. Maybe you need to shout because they're in danger. And the answer is to shout. So those are strategies that you work with, and that the people who are closest to the activism, because I'm talking here about activists, not just about people who are having study circles to examine their racism. A lot of people are doing that. Maybe they need it. I can't say to them, don't do it. It's not what I would do. It wouldn't be my preferred thing, but I can say, okay, maybe they get something out of it. But my request to them would say, don't think that everything that goes on inside a community, some other person's community, is something that you can never comment on or that you can't have a position on. If you would be outraged if it were happening to you,
yes,
why wouldn't you be outraged if it's, if you live in a very liberal society where you can leave your religion anytime you choose, or you never had a religion growing up and it's all fine with your family, then why are you judgmental about, and say we've all been called Islamophobic for the things we say. So we know where, I can understand the frustrations of ex-Muslims when you see a lot of that stuff and you say, oh my God, these are all the people who've been shutting us up for years. And they're using this issue of racism as a way of doing it. But I think we have to be able to distinguish between that's bullshit, and the fact that the roots of the history of empire and the legacy of slavery are very deep in this country, and that people are being misinformed or they have a ridiculous view of themselves, where the Tory politicians are talking about this is a great country, we did all this free trade. I mean, what they did as free trade before was done with gunboats, I just listened to a lecture yesterday. I think I've posted links to it about the Clive statue. Now, Clive in his time was known to be a murderer, a looter, somebody who, Clive of India, he, East India Company, he conquered Bengal and so on. So helped to set up the British Empire in India. And he was known in his time to be a very nasty man. Now he's seen as a hero. So when people say things like, oh, those were just, that's in the past, those were the attitudes of the time. No, they were contested in the time. So all these discussions about statues is actually digging up what that contest was, not just that we're looking at it with our attitudes now, which we do, but also because even at that time, those things were known about. So one of a man who's done a study of the East India Company, he said that when he first heard about British gunboats going to China, he thought that they were to, stop the opium trade or something. They were promoting the opium trade. They forced Indian peasants to grow opium. They took the opium to China. They forced it on China. How does Britain think is going to do free trade treaties when it doesn't have that empire that actually forced unequal terms of trade on people. Free trade was a joke. So if people don't know that, how are they going to come to any rational and reasonable understandings of the state of the modern world if they don't understand that history? Because it's living with us today. And secondly, the hostile environment, which many ex-Muslims have experienced, which is the environment which Theresa May said, I want to make Britain a hostile environment for illegal immigration. But what they did was the Windrush scandal. That is, they stripped nationality from people who were British citizens. Yeah. And they suddenly, because they didn't have 30 years of pay slips and so on, they had their nationality stripped. That meant that they lost their jobs, they lost their homes, they were made destitute, and they were illegally deported. And Windrush is happening to Asians, it's happening to all sorts of people, and it's still happening now. And ex-Muslims are experiencing it because, clients of CMB have been in detention centers, they've been raided, they've been picked up. So you have the hostility to dealing with religious fundamentalists within the community, because you need to maintain religious privilege, partly in order to continue the privilege of the Church of England and the mutual interlocking forms of religious privilege. And then you have the hostility to giving people a rights-based existence and dignity. And therefore, you do have to discuss issues of racism or white supremacy. I would rather discuss them in terms of the old slogan of black and white, unite and fight. And actually, I think a lot of young people, in spite of this identity politics, are also getting together to talk about these things and to do things together, and to be active around these issues. So I think it is happening. And actually, I'm glad that black has come back as a term, because in between, we were all really reduced to our religious identities. And at least that overarching thing of those who choose to identify as black, which I do, SBS was accused actually by an Afro-Caribbean group of taking money as a black group and therefore taking it from other groups, which I think is nonsense, because actually it's been a deeply unfashionable thing to go on calling themselves black. And they've gone on doing it precisely because it evokes a wider struggle and a liberation struggle against empire and against colonialism, and actually for universal human rights, for the right to leave religion. That was in the Universal Declaration. And I've spoken about it before at ex-Muslim conferences, that there were Muslim countries and Muslims who signed up to the right to leave religion. Pakistan signed it because it was an Ahmadi who spoke for it. It was an Indian Muslim who said this is compatible with the Constitution of India and signed it. Egypt signed it. So when we're fighting against blasphemy laws, we have that background of universalism and of a common framework to work under, And I think so we have to keep both those things in mind, because if we didn't have the autonomous groups, then the kind of challenge that we mounted on virginity tests, of the term forced marriage and campaigned against forced marriage, on caste issues, on Rushdie, that wouldn't have been there. On Hindutva, it wouldn't have been there if we didn't have the autonomous group. But at the same time, we needed to make the alliances. So I'd say that's my politics. I can't force anybody into the same frame. They might want to do it some other way. And I think, yes, there is a lot of guilt tripping that goes on. But I think if you only see that story, then you're missing two other stories, which is the identity politics of the British conservatives, because the Sharia inquiry, which was a rotten inquiry, was not Labour. Labour would have, I think, set it up with a more human rights-based mandate. Or we would have had more influence in arguing about that with Labour. But this was under Theresa May. Even under Michael Gove, as I said, scourge of the jihadis, he's setting up more religious schools and saying that you have to teach this happy, clappy version of empire, which is a joke in the rest of the world. Yes. So we've gone backwards. So they are promoting identity politics. And by the way, I have to tell you this story, Ali.
Yes.
One last story, because you will enjoy this one because it's a Pakistan-related story. So what did they do when they decided, we look bigoted and so on? So they parachuted a lot of Black people, Asian people into positions. I mean, the Tories now racially quite mixed, right? And what did they do with Saida Warsi? They put her in the House of Lords. She'd failed to get elected. They put her in the House of Lords. They made her co-chairman of the Conservative Party. What did they do with her? They sent her to the OIC to, show how multicultural they were to the Muslim countries.
Yeah.
Then she went on a trip to Pakistan with Cameron. And who did she take in her baggage train with her? One of her personal advisors who was not vetted by the security service. I can't imagine how this huge boo-boo took place. Was a man who was supposedly a former, I said supposedly former, but he'd been known to be a member of the Hizb ut-Tahrir.
Wow, really?
Ali, I don't know if you know what the Pakistan government's relation and the deep state, the Pakistan army's relation to the Hizb ut-Tahrir, right? They have their favorite jihadi groups, Lashkar-e-Toiba, and the various groups that are the pro-government jihadi groups, right?
Yeah.
And then they have the bad Taliban, the good Taliban and the bad Taliban. The bad Taliban, which targets Pakistan instead of targeting Afghans and killing Afghans. So there's the bad groups. Hizb ut-Tahrir, they hate and loathe, because what is the Hizb ut-Tahrir strategy? It's to get into the government and specifically into the army and try and overthrow it from within, have a coup. That was their strategy all over the place. That's what I think Majid Nawaz went to do when he went as Hizb ut-Tahrir to Pakistan. So if there's one jihadi or former, they're not jihadis, but fundamentalists, extremists that you shouldn't take to Pakistan, it's Hizb ut-Tahrir member. Don't tell me the Tories don't play identity politics and it's only a left-wing thing. It is a left-wing thing, but it's there, absolutely embedded in the way in which the Tories function as well.
Yeah, that brings me to another question. Over the years, I've been in this country only for only 10 years. I've read about most of the things you guys have experienced it. But from my personal experience in Britain, I think there has been some progress made in relations to racism. There's been a lot of progress made, in fact, because we don't see blatant, out-and-out racism in the streets anymore, as much as there was back in those days. And do you think some of this modern day identity politics, or at least the ones who shout the loudest out there, do they undermine the progress or not acknowledge the progress that's been made in race relations?
The thing is, I've lived here, on and off since the 70s. And really after Brexit, for many of us who lived here before, and I would think my friends in SBS and Yasmin Rahman, who's spoken at so many of our meetings and so on, we've had relatives who've been attacked. We've had, and in London, I feel generally very safe, I don't expect this kind of thing, but you feel if you're speaking in, I don't know, I know several people, and this is not just racism against Black people, it's racism against, it's xenophobia as well. So mothers speaking to their children in a different language have been shouted at in the street. And sometimes they're European women. So Italians in my family, Germans, speaking to their children have been shouted, you guys are not wanted. So I think Brexit was a huge setting back. So I think there's this, as I said, there's this paradox of Britain. So on the one hand, it's a very racially mixed society. There's a sort of cultural ease in a lot of ways, particularly in a big cosmopolitan city like London. But we cannot forget the hostile environment, because what that's done is turn into border guards people who are university lecturers, landlords, banks, everybody wants your passport, your right to stay. The restrictions on people entering university and accessing an education. For instance, the grandchildren of Windrush people, falsely accused because they simply didn't have the papers. They couldn't prove for 30 years of wage slips. Who keeps 30 years of wage slips? So they lost their jobs. Their grandchildren couldn't enter university. Now, if we have to look both at the social ease, but actually the legal environment is far, far, far worse than it was. Because back in the 70s, you probably had more street racism, which is coming back again, but you had more rights if you came to this country. And those rights have been stripped away by people who came not just as undocumented, who may have rights as refugees. As we know, many ex-Muslims come and they may not have proper documentation, or they may come to study and then decide to leave their family or come out or whatever. Then they reapply as refugees and they go through you've dealt with these cases. People go through a really hard time. The legal aid has been stripped back.
Yes.
It's happened in the criminal justice system more regularly. So many of the foundational things that we value about Britain, the rule of law, we had a gold standard legal aid. This was something that Britain used to promote across the world, to get better legal aid in Bangladesh, Nigeria, very many countries I visited. And their lawyers have come here to visit, one of the best examples of British soft power, to come and visit the courts, to visit human rights lawyers in this country and so on. And they've got a lot of inspiration from aspects of British law on hate crimes, on institutional racism, on the Macpherson report, things like that, to understand, for instance, caste discrimination in India, and other forms of discrimination, anti-Muslim hate and things like that. So, Britain can help, but actually the legal environment, I cannot emphasize this enough, is far worse than when I arrived. I mean, there was more housing available. There was more available for people to be able to settle. And now there's an atmosphere of absolute shortage in which there's such hatred from people who feel they're losing out that it's all focused on the Black working class. So, I think there are a lot of people, I think there is middle class racism and ridiculous attitudes and a lot of things that we see. This is why I talked about Michaela Cole, because the scene beautifully presents that. But there are other issues as well, which that one delves into. And there's another series called Acme Bridge. I don't know if you ever saw that. It's on Channel 4.
I haven't seen it. I've only seen trailers for it.
It's quite fun. It's much lighter. It's quite silly, a lot of it, but it's quite funny. But it's about relations between a largely Pakistani community and mostly white people, white working class people. And it talks about the complexity of those relationships, because it's not also a one-way street. So they're very enmeshed. They're very close friendships and relationships. There is also racism. There are also rich Pakistanis. It's an academy school run by a rich Pakistani businessman, and it's based on a true story of two schools which were very racially separated that came together. So there's a complicated story about race, which some of the better stories are being told on television about that. But there is a legal environment of extreme hostility and extreme shortage that was exacerbated by austerity, which happened to everybody, which affected us very personally. It affected me, with my son, where his mental health problems weren't being dealt with, which has, affected people during the lockdown. Thousands of young people have been disappeared out of care and, out of the system. Nobody knows what's happening to them. They're subject to grooming. So you have to look at the issues that are happening within the community and the issues of state failure, which didn't have to happen. They happened as a conscious result of political choices, and which are exacerbating problems of racism. So those are the things that, if it's my preference, that's what I wish people would be looking at. But actually, I find the discussion on statues, on Clive, on Colston, on a slaver statue that's in the East End that I got involved with the discussion of, where there's a museum discussing it only because somebody started a petition. And I found out, because I sit on a panel in that museum, that they actually had a biography of this man published in 2013. That's only, 7 years ago, this century, which talks in detail about his slaving activities, but it doesn't make any comment on them. It still talks about him as a pious, wonderful man. So we do have to look at these issues and the reasons why slavery was normalized so much, and why modern forms of slavery are going to be normalized today. Because believe you me, that what Brexit means is going to be more undocumented people working under the radar, and the stripping of rights from the people who are documented but already in terrible conditions, like care workers and so on. So the government is, the signs are they're not learning anything from this pandemic in terms of making working conditions secure, from people who are at the bottom end of the scale, be they white or black, and what they're doing, and they're certainly doing nothing about the hostile environment. They're actually hanging on to it. I mean, with the points-based system, it's not a new thing. It's the thing that caused the 100,000 loss of jobs, job shortages in the NHS. So it's not, we don't have a good future. So I think we have to look at both sides of this, Adi, call out the nonsense, but actually see that there's a very, very serious problem of very bad law. And if we want to protect what's good about Britain, it's to fight to get back the rule of law, to fight to get back legal aid, to fight for hate crimes to be properly recognized. So people being abused because of religious reasons internal to their community are also recognized alongside racist abuse and other kinds of abuse. So we have to look at all those things at the same time.
Yes, brilliant. Thank you. I can listen to you for hours and hours. And I think we've run the time, and I have a meeting just 10 minutes from now. So we'll go towards ending it. If you quickly, I know you've touched upon it already, if you just quickly lay out a framework for future, what should we be doing? What's the future looks like, and what the activist community should be doing in regards to these issues?
Listen, we are dealing with a crisis that's going to carry on for a long time. This COVID thing is not a one-night wonder, right? Britain already has a very high rate of death. So I think issues of activist communities, I think food security is a major issue. So whatever people can do in their communities and mutual aid groups. I mean, the British people have, as a whole, stood up amazingly to this crisis. I think the government has failed and the people have stood up and tried to stand together. But at the same time, there are going to be some people who are much worse affected. And the people who are undocumented or who are fighting on asylum and refugee cases, and ex-Muslims are among those people. We have to keep on fighting on those issues to make sure that the government doesn't get away with completely having a set of completely uncountable parallel structures. Serco, which is run by Winston Churchill's grandson, Nicholas Soames, is a company that has been engaged in huge amounts of human rights violations and abuses, running, hostels, homes, centers, and now they're running track and trace, the contact tracing system, and doing really badly. And they weren't set up to run it, but they were given a huge contract because they want to get their hands on NHS money. So for me, because I'm a socialist, I mean, other people may feel differently, but I am a socialist. And I think even if you're a Tory, people have realized that a lot of the privatization hasn't worked, and you need to get accountable systems. Until we have accountable systems, we're not going to be able to fight the issues of religion that we're fighting.
Yes, of course. Right then. Thank you so much, Gita. Thank you for joining us.
And thank you. Thank you.
No, thank you. And I hope to see you again soon once this whole lockdown and everything is ended.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Before we go offline, I just wanted to tell you guys.
I sent you the stuff in private chat, so there's some things that you could put up. Maybe I can try and put them into the general.
I'll add them in the. I'll add them in the details, video details.
Okay, there was somebody asking about the growth of the Muslim Brotherhood.
You want to answer that quickly?
Well, just very quickly. I mean, the British government has sat and watched it happen. British spies are constantly talking to the Muslim Brotherhood. The security services have, they've gone up and down about it. They've done reports, but the report that the British government took out, they slipped out over Christmas one year. They excised most of the information. I mean, the Muslim Brotherhood presence is here at the courtesy of the British.
Sorry. Thank you. Thank you so much, Gita. So our next event's on the 18th of next month, 18th of August, with Jamal from Council of Ex-Muslims of Norway. It's going to be on Islam and how it's installed in children and how its impacts on human well-being and mentality, I guess. Make sure you join us for that. And there is one. We do our sport groups. You can go to cmb.org.uk on our events page and check out all the details. If you want to be part of the sport group, please send an email to hello@exmuslim.org.uk. And that's it for now. Thanks for joining us. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.